has provided just by way of context for like-minded people to gather together. Today, in our breakout, we give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about ministry, burnout, self-care, things that are tangentially connected to that. And my hope is that at the end of the time, we'll also have some time for some question and answers. So if you have questions that are coming up, just feel free to jot them down, and Lord willing, at the end of our time, we'll be able to interact with them. So let's go ahead and get started. In ministry, one of the things I think especially in counseling, that we are finding more and more of are pastors and elders and deacons and ministry leaders suffering with burnout and depression. And one of the things that was, I think, pretty arresting for myself, and one of the reasons I think I have an interest in this topic, as we've been talking about vulnerability and need and weakness here at the conference, one of the vulnerable things I think oftentimes we can do as pastors and ministry leaders is admit that we need help, to admit that we ourselves need counseling. So I realized I see a counselor on a regular basis, and probably about a year ago, on one of my meetings with my counselor, I started talking to him about some of the things that I was experiencing. I was talking to him about some of the ways that I was feeling, describing fatigue, how I wake up in the morning and I still feel tired, and I was asking his advice as it were on what he thought it might be. Is it relationships? Is it stress at work? Is it unrealistic expectations? And he just said something. He said, I think what you're talking about is burnout. He said, it sounds like you're struggling with burnout. That was a little bit, and as a counselor, it shouldn't have surprised me, but it surprised me in that moment. This is something I talk about all the time with other people. I try to counsel other people. And guess what? We're not immune from it, right? Even pastors in the ministry understand and experience burnout. And so I think that what we want to do here at the front end is to try to explore a little bit of the reason why we, and especially pastors and ministry leaders, why is it that we struggle in this particular way? Evangelist George Whitfield once said, he said, I would rather wear out than rust out. Rather wear out than rust out. To which another pastor later on in time famously replied, he said, well, I really don't want to go Whitfield's way. I don't really want to wear out, and I don't really want to rust out. He says, I really just want to finish out. I just want to finish out the race faithfully. But many of us, I think, are kind of like Whitfield, right? There's this insatiable pull, I think, especially in Asian American cultures, to succeed and to work and to work harder and harder. And sooner or later, as one professor says, we run up into the reality that we are creatures, right? That we have limitations, and we either do that by choice, we either do that because we realize that we are limited embodied beings, or we run up into it not by our own choosing. We run into it, maybe we have a mental breakdown, maybe we run into it by just sheer exhaustion or depression. A lot of times I think this is due in some part because the gospel calls us to a life of self-sacrifice, right? You remember Luke 9:23, Jesus says, take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me, right? There's this idea, Richard Rohr talks about this myth of heroic self-sacrifice, right? This idea of, well, if we're really being a good Christian, then every single day I am waking up and I am denying myself and taking up the cross, and I am following Jesus, and that means expending myself out to the point of exhaustion. But what happens over time is, as we exhaust ourselves, as we continue to work hard, we fail to realize too that the way that God created us as embodied beings is that we are people with physical, emotional, and spiritual limitations. And the more and more that we work harder and chase after success or certain numbers or certain achievements, as one author says, we don't just look after successes, but over time we become our successes too. Those things end up telling us a part of who we are or our identity in an unhelpful way. So the tough spot that many ministry leaders and pastors find themselves in is, how do we navigate that paradox of what does it look like to spend myself out for the gospel, to pursue Christ, to be self-sacrificial in my love, but also at the same time to heed Scripture's calls to keep watch over my own soul, to examine myself, to take heed to my own soul, to care for and to maintain this earthly temple that the Lord distorted to me. So we'll try to explore that in the balance of the time that we have. We're just simply going to use 3 headings. And just borrow these from Walter Brown. We'll talk about the life of disorientation. We'll look at what the disoriented life of the pastor or the ministry leader looks like. Then we'll look at reorientation. What does it look like to essentially move from that movement of disorientation to reorientation? And then in the final third part time, we'll talk about the life of orientation. What does a life rightly oriented towards the Lord look like? So we'll tackle the first one first, disorientation. Let me just set the stage briefly for you by way of context of just what the landscape looks like currently for pastors and ministry leaders. In 2022, 42% of pastors considered quitting full-time Christian ministry. That's a significant increase from 2021. Only 14% of pastors say that they are satisfied with their mental health. And 58% of pastors, that's 6 out of 10, say their mental health is impacting their role as a pastor. And I think when you look at the data, they're not saying that 58% are saying it's had a positive impact, but that's to be read negatively. That 58% of pastors, or 6 out of every 10, are saying that their mental health struggles are negatively impacting their life. You would think that with such a high percentage of people, especially pastors and ministry leaders, struggling with that type of statistic in terms of their mental health, you would think that there would be a huge push then for pastors to be receiving help, to be getting help, to be going to counseling. But an astonishingly low percentage, only 9% of pastors seek out counseling, seek out any type of help. 24 and 13% say respectively they don't do it because it's too expensive and they just don't have enough time. That latter one is probably the one that I hear the most in my own practice, right? Pastors say, listen, I love counseling, I just don't have the time. Well, where am I supposed to squeeze in a weekly appointment with someone and I don't even know if I have to drive a half hour, 45 minutes just to find someone? It's just not worth it. I'm more than willing to just suffer and plod along and then to just add in another appointment to my schedule. LifeWay Research interviewed over 1,000 pastors to determine some of the greatest things that U.S. pastors were facing. They identified a couple of different buckets of challenges, and in particular, mental health challenges was one of the largest challenges that pastors were facing. Again, none of this will surprise you. Things like stress, discouragement, distraction, loneliness, depression, and an overall lack of contentment. When we think about depression from maybe more of a clinical mental health perspective, I've included there for you the diagnostic criteria for an official diagnosis of depression. You can read that for insomnia at night if you're curious and wanting to know what that looks like, or if you want to be more depressed, as it were, you can read that. But oftentimes I think when we think about depression, I think a better or more helpful way to come at it is maybe not by just listing off a list of sterile clinical criteria pieces, but what does it actually look like in real time? Actually, what does it look like in terms of a narrative or story? Ed Welch, who's already been mentioned earlier from the platform, has this really helpful blog article called Depression's Odd Filter. And he talks about one of the things about depression is that it creates this odd filter that filters in and filters out everything that we might hear or interact with. So let's just read it for you. It's just pretty brief. He says, someone says to you, I love you. You hear nothing. Actually, you hear something. You hear a little voice in your brain that says, I'm worthless. You're only saying that you love me because you have to. Somehow from the mouths of other people to your ear, all words of blessing and encouragement get tumbled upside down and backward, and you just confirm your suspicions about yourself. You are such an abject failure. You are unloved. You are unlovable. And listen, everyone around you knows it. There are hundreds of variations on this. You look nice today. Push it through the filter of depression and you get, not true. I know I'm ugly. Or you seem to be feeling a little bit better today. This means, oh, so you don't want to talk to me anymore. This is your brain on depression. We can also add, this is your brain on shame. Right? There is something about depression that creates this odd filter to the well-intentioned words and actions of loved ones. And depression, because of that, can seem difficult, oftentimes for other people to understand. Maybe let's particularize it even for those of you in here in ministry, right? Somebody comes up to you after church on Sunday and says, hey, Pastor, that was such a good message. Thank you for sharing that. You push it through the odd filter of depression. You call yourself a pastor? It's a horrible message. I bet they can't wait for so-and-so to preach next week, or you have no business being in the pulpit. Or maybe somebody comes up to you and says, hey, just want to give you an update. We had 15 people signed up for that new service initiative at church. You push it through depression's odd filter and you tell yourself, are you kidding? You should be so ashamed of yourself. You can't even get a big group of people together to serve and to serve in that ministry. You're such a failure. Nobody wants to follow you. Or somebody says to you after an elders meeting or after a ministry or a committee meeting, they say, hey, thanks so much for speaking up. We really needed to hear your voice at that meeting. And you push it through the filter of depression. You're so domineering. You're so overbearing. Nobody ever can get a word in edgewise with you. Right? There's something about depression. There's something about the way that depression works that it creates this odd filter on words and actions and movements towards us. It's almost as if it always tilts everything back at a 90-degree angle in the opposite direction. What are some of the ways that pastors and ministry leaders handle depression? Just kind of tick off a few different ones I've seen just based off of experience in the companies that we see at our center. The first one, and I say this is the biggest one, is most ministry leaders and pastors beat themselves up. They beat themselves up. They say to themselves things like, I'm such a failure. I have no business being in public ministry. There's an immense shame and guilt over a perceived duality and hypocrisy. One of the things when I talk to pastors that they oftentimes struggle with is they say, listen, on Sunday after Sunday, I'm getting up and I'm preaching sermons about joy and contentment and finding rest in the Lord, and yet even in my own life, I'm not living that out. And instead of running to the Lord, then in the midst of that, what depression does is it just says, listen, man, you're such a hypocrite. Right? If people really knew the real you, they would leave your church. And over time, that sense of duality or hypocrisy begins to wear on you. A lot of times, after we beat ourselves up, we try to engage in penance or atonement type exercise. Well, if I just tried harder, if I just worked harder, if I just did something a little bit better, maybe that would help me overcome this problem. Another common way that I think ministry leaders and pastors handle depression is just simply through ignoring it or kind of procrastinating or put off getting help. They just like to kind of take some of those feelings and either put them up in the basement of their life or shove them down in the basement or in the attic of their life. A lot of times when we think about procrastination, for instance, or numbing oneself to emotions, we typically think of people who procrastinate as being lazy or slothful. But one of the things that we know, especially from a counseling perspective about procrastination and indifference, is that they tend to not be about being lazy or slothful, but they're negative emotional coping mechanisms, right? That there are certain negative emotions oftentimes that we feel that we don't want to feel, right? We don't want to feel sad, we don't want to feel depressed, we don't want to feel discouraged, and so we just kind of ignore them, or we try to numb ourselves to them, or we try to put them off, as it were. Another way that I find pastors and ministry leaders struggle or battle depression is by getting busier. Busyness is oftentimes a sign of depression, and that might seem counterintuitive, especially to a room full of pastors and ministry leaders, because when you think about depression, what you might think of is, man, you can't get out of bed, you're super tired, you're not showering, you're not eating, you're refusing food. But there's also a side of depression that is quite high functioning, right? Where one of the ways that we manage the negative feelings of burnout and sadness is we just work harder. We just get busier and busier and busier. And so oftentimes we might actually not see the signs of depression or burnout very early on in our life because from the outside, people view you as so productive. Right? Man, you get things done like that. Man, you are so productive. You're in all of these meetings. You're on all of these committees and boards, and for a long time, people might not even suspect that you struggle with depression or burnout because you are so productive. And so when you do tell somebody, hey, I'm struggling with depression, or I think I'm getting burned out, it can oftentimes be confusing for them. Other ways that pastors and ministry leaders struggle with depression would be just different means of escape, and I'll just give you a few of those. Things like food, TV or social media, pornography. A lot of times when we're struggling in depression and burnout, we're ultimately looking for an escape, right? There's something out in our world, something out in our external world that is too difficult or challenging for us to face. So at the end of the day, when we get home or on our ride home, it's just a lot easier to escape into a fantasy world. Or maybe it's just easier to find our pleasure or our hope in food or in sports or on TV or other things. Right? All of those items that we just talked about could be an indicator of depression and burnout. They're not necessarily, I don't want anyone to think that, hey, if one of those things ticked off for you, they're not means that you're depressed or burnout, but it could be, right? So let me just do this, right? In a session like this where you're coming and you're wanting to learn about depression and burnout, just even pause for a moment and just ask yourself as you look over that list, are any of these characteristic of your own life? Just take a brief moment, just 30 seconds to do a little bit of a mental inventory, right? Do you find yourself just engaging in more and more activity, just to be busier and busier and busier, to kind of put away negative emotions? Do you find yourself lately, the past season of life, turning to TV, turning to food, turning to a particular hobby, right? Again, there's nothing bad about any of those things at the surface level, but are you finding that instead of turning to the Lord or towards others for help, these have just become practiced, well-worn muscles for you to turn to? Just think for a moment. Just take a little bit of an inventory, right? A lot of times we don't allow ourselves to have time to be introspective or to think. This, my friends, is what we might say is the disoriented or the burned out life. This is what it looks like and feels like and sounds like. So if that's what the current landscape looks like, then our second movement is this. How do we as ministry leaders then, how do we reorient our lives to properly care for and prioritize our own souls and our own bodies? David Powlison writes this. He says, here's the sweet paradox in how God works. He blesses those who admit that they need help. He blesses those who admit that they need help. I have been so encouraged, and I have loved hearing all of the different speakers in different ways today talk about the beauty of needing help, the beauty of admitting weakness. Right? When we think about the Beatitudes, right, the Beatitudes essentially are an inventory not of personal accomplishment or resume virtues or how great you are. The Beatitudes, right, are all about essential human need, about how all of us need help. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Right? It doesn't say, blessed are those who have it all together in their church. Blessed are those who run perfect meetings. Blessed are those who run X amount of people in attendance. No, it's blessed are those who are what? Who are poor in spirit. So the good news for every single one of us in this room is that the fundamental posture of God is for those who say, hey, hand raised, I need help. Hand raised, I don't think I can do this. Right? God didn't come, Jesus didn't come to seek and to save those who have it all together, who never struggle, who are always smiling, always happy, and never experiencing difficulty. He came to seek and save lost, helpless, needy people like ourselves. So let's do a little bit of a pause then in this reorientation section. Let's go to Scripture. And if you have your Bibles, turn over with me to Psalm 31. And I'm not going to preach a sermon by any means, but I think Psalm 31 holds out some really important truths that we can learn from David's experience of ultimately disorientation. Now, I'm not saying that David was depressed or burned out, although I think you can make a case for that based on what we read. But what we do find is we find David, like we often find a lot of the psalmists, at their ropes' end, struggling in the midst of life. So let's read verses 1 through 8 together. David says, in you, O Lord, do I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me and rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress. And for your name's sake, you lead me and guide me. You take me out of the net that they have hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord and faithful God. I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction, and you have known the distress of my soul. You have not delivered me into the hand of the enemy. You have set my feet in a broad place. David does 4 different things in this psalm that I think are helpful, the first of which is this, and these are all under that heading of reorientation. What does it look like to move from that disorientation that we described earlier, and how do we reorient our soul before the Lord? The first thing is this, as David comes to the Lord. He comes to the Lord. In the opening verses, David calls out to the Lord, and here's the simple movement, right? From David to the Lord is this, Lord, something in my life hurts. Something in my life is not right. I'm immediately going to bring it to the Lord. Now, why does David do that? There's 2 reasons why I think David does this. First is David knows the character of the Lord. David knows the character of the Lord. Psalm 31, if we have time to read it through together, Psalm 31 abounds with reflections and reminders about who the Lord is. All throughout Psalm 31, David talks about the steadfast love of the Lord, the faithfulness of the Lord, his knowledge of David. The Old Testament commentator Derek Kidner says that the good grounds of David's appeal is not in David's persuasiveness, but it's in God's righteousness. That the good grounds of David's ability to come to the Lord is not how eloquent David is in describing his need. It's not how elegant David is in mapping out what's going on. No, the root of David's appeal is not in himself, but it's in his confidence in who the Lord is. But secondly, not only does David know God's character, which enables him to come to the Lord, but second, David knows this God personally. David knows this God personally. Listen, you don't come to a God that you don't have a personal relationship with and ask for the things that David asks for, right? David comes to the Lord, and like a child comes to his father or to his mother, he says, come to me, draw near to me, rescue me speedily. Well, listen to how personally David speaks of the Lord. In verses 2 and 3, listen to all those personal pronouns. Incline your ear to me, be a rock of refuge for me, be a strong fortress to save me. You are my rock, my fortress. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Right? And you go up throughout the psalm, David is personally connected to this God that he is crying out. And these personal pronouns, right? This isn't hubris, this isn't self-centered demands. These are just simply the words and the heart cries of one who is in an abiding relationship with the Lord. And friends, one of the things that I take away from Psalm 31 is this, is that God doesn't just care about people generally. Like, yeah, he just loves people, he's for people. No, God knows you personally. God knows you personally. God knows what you're going through. And David knew that, and I think that enabled David to come to the Lord. But how often do we actually do the exact opposite? How often do we allow the distress and the challenges that we face in ministry to keep us from running to the Lord? Right? One of the big things I hear from pastors and people that are in positions of influence is, well, listen, I don't want to be needy. I don't want to have to ask for help. I feel like I should be able to do this on my own. Right? We are not people who are used to being needy. Right? We're not people who are used to being a burden on others. Right? That's not a feeling that we like to have. But in so many ways, Psalm 31, if we were to read it from God's perspective, it might be this: be a burden to me. I want to know what's on your heart. And in so many ways, here is one of the ways that we actually know that we are growing in the Lord. Is that the gap or the space in between when we experience trouble in our world and when we run to the Lord for help, that over time that gap continually narrows in our Christian life. That from the moment trouble hits you, from the moment there's conflict in an elders meeting, from the moment there's disappointment in your your marriage, from the moment that you experience a child walking away from the faith, from the moment that a member tells you they're leaving your church, that space between when you experience that and when you run to the Lord, that a defining mark of maturity and reorientation is that you do that quicker and quicker and quicker. Lord, there's trouble in my world. Lord, I'm going to come to you. So David comes to the Lord. Second part of life of reorientation is that he names what is broken. David names what is broken. Now, commentators note that verses 9 through 22 are likely a recapitulation and an intensification of the troubles that David mentions in verses 1 through 8. So if you look at verse 7, David says, I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love because you have seen my affliction and you have known the distress of my soul. And then what happens in verses 8 all the way really throughout the end of the chapter is David then goes about specifically naming what is broken. And here's what I want you to take away, is that David starts off by describing what's hard, what he's suffering, and he does it generally, but then he also moves on to talk about it specifically. And I think that is so encouraging for us today, especially for those of us who might be struggling with burnout or depression or just a sense of indifference, is that what we realize in Psalm 31 is that God does not shy away from the particulars of our struggles, meaning that God never comes to us and says, hey, can you just kind of summarize and sanitize your suffering for me? Just kind of sum it up, because I've got a lot of other people that I'm talking to right now. I've got a lot of other pastors and ministry leaders on the docket. Could you just put this in a 2-verse summary for me? No. This is a God who is intimately desiring of you to be specific about what is broken. He wants to know that your years are spent with sighing, that your strength fails because of iniquity, that your bones are wasting away, that you're facing mysterious enemies, that people who see you move away from you, that people forget you like one who is dead, that you feel like a broken vessel. And we could go on and name all of the ways that David is specific in describing what is broken. But friends, here is what is so difficult, I find, for people in ministry, is that we can be experts at telling our people to do this, but amateurs at doing it ourselves. And that's what part of that duality or that hypocrisy, right? I'm sure you have all told people in your church, hey, run to the Lord in your suffering. Talk to him about what's difficult. But what happens? We tell other people to do that, but guess what? We don't do that. We don't do that. We can be experts at telling other people, but amateurs at doing it for ourselves. Steve Bloom writes this. He says the Psalms treat depression so much more realistically than many of today's popular books on Christianity and psychology. David and the other psalmists often found themselves deeply depressed for various reasons. They did not apologize for what they were feeling, nor did they confess it as sin. It was simply a legitimate part of their relationship with God. They interacted with him in the context of their depression. And for some of us, especially sometimes, I think this can be a little bit of a difficult part of our relationship with God, especially as we are reorienting our life. This feeling language can feel foreign to us. I find especially for men, this is a struggle for men in particular, simply to describe, what are you feeling? What are you experiencing right now? And sometimes it can be because, well, we don't want to be led by our feelings. We don't want to be feeling driven. We want to be word driven. We want to be driven by God's objective truth. And that's true, but what I would say to that is we can validate the truthfulness of our feelings without allowing our feelings to validate the truth. We can validate the truthfulness of our feelings. We can be honest and say, hey, I am feeling, and you fill in the blank. But we can also realize that our feelings don't validate the truth. Right? The truth ultimately is found in God's Word, and my feelings don't change that. But we also can admit and know that we serve a God who desires for us to come to him and to be honest about what it is that we are going through. So David comes to the Lord, he names what is broken. The third thing that he does is he identifies the good. And I love that Kathy mentioned this in the Q&A panel when she's talking about what is a part of discipleship and ministry in the church is, listen, we want to name the good, we want to identify the good, and The good is sprinkled throughout here, right? We might think of the Psalms as being pretty depressing, but if you look for it, there's good everywhere in the Psalms. In the midst of naming what hurts, David gives us some little clues. And there's one particular good in here that I want to draw your attention to, and that's in verses 6 and 14. In 6 and 14, it's what commentators call an inclusio. It's kind of like a little bookend that David includes. But in verses 6 and 14, David says this. He says, listen, I hate those who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. David says, listen, at the end of the day, here's what I'm going to do in the midst of all that's going on is I am going to trust in the Lord. I'm not going to cling to worthless idols. Christopher asked, in commenting on this psalm, he says, listen, essentially what David is saying is this, is when times are hard, in who or what will you cling to? In who or what will you allow your heart to worship? What captures your imagination or your affections, right, during times of suffering? What promises you an easy life? And David says, listen, I've gone through all the different solutions, and here's the one that I know I will come to. It's I have to trust in the Lord. Well, finally, David comes to the Lord. He names what is broken. He identifies a good. For David, that good was that the Lord is trustworthy. Fourth, he invites others in. Look at the last two verses of the psalm. 23 and 24, David says, love the Lord, all you his what? All you his saints. The Lord preserves the faithful, but abundantly repays the one who acts in pride. Be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord. Right? Most of the Psalms always include at the very end this invitation for other people to join in, meaning that the Psalms were never meant to just be these private exercises of lament, but they were meant to be invitations for everyone around them to join in. This is one of the reasons why I think depression is so difficult, why burnout is so difficult, is because one of the features of depression is that it isolates you away from other people. You don't invite others in. 37% of pastors and ministry leaders say they never talk about their mental health, publicly or privately. 37%. It's nearly 4 out of every 10 people saying, listen, it's just something that I don't talk about. I don't bring it up. I'm not going to let other people in. Well, friends, that's not what Scripture calls us to. Scripture says, listen, invite others in. Invite others in to walk this journey with you, and together, not on your own, wait on the Lord. Take heart. Be of good courage. Well, that's what the reoriented life looks like. If that's what it takes in a biblical narrative type of way, what does it look like to move from disorientation to reorientation? Is that we come to the Lord, we name what is broken, we identify the good, we invite others in. What we'll spend the balance of our time looking at then is, what does that life look like? What am I after, right? If I have done all of those things, if I have come to the Lord and named what is broken, what might the life of proper orientation and rest before the Lord look like? I just want to give you 4 lessons, 4 kind of categories to maybe put some thoughts underneath to help us give some vision of what the oriented life looks like. We'll talk about self, Sabbath, solitude, and socializing. First, the self, right? What does a life rightly oriented around ourselves in relationship to God look like? What does it look like to be mindful of the internal life? David Benner says, careful attention to one's inner life is an indispensable prerequisite of caring for the souls of others. All of you in here, I'm assuming, for one reason or another, you care for the souls of others. That's why you're here. That's why you're at a conference like this for pastors and ministry leaders. A prerequisite, Benner is saying, for caring for others is that you are attentive to your own soul. Right? I've seen pastors, I've seen ministry leaders who are in ministry who have successful external ministries, hundreds of people come into their churches, $1 million church budgets, but who are not connected to their inner life. And you know the difficulties and dynamics that creates for them from a mental health perspective? That leads to narcissism. It leads to abuse of power. It leads to a divided life where, listen, I don't pay attention to what's going on, and I only live this externalized, successful ministry life. Paul tells us in 1 Timothy 4:16, on yourself. So what are some key areas that we need to evaluate? 3 relationships you might say that in relationship with self we need to be mindful of. The first is time. What is your relationship to time? I love how John O'Donohue describes stress. He says stress is a perverted relationship to time. Stress is a perverted relationship to time, meaning time is a limited resource. You only have 24 hours in a day. Hopefully you were not up for all 24 of those hours. So it's only a portion of those hours. And stress says, listen, I can do more in the allotted time that I have than I physically am able to do. And when we do more than what we are designed and created to do in a given amount of time, you know what that leads to? It leads to stress. And stress is something that affects and impacts our bodies. It's something that 63% of pastors say is the number one challenge that they face in ministry is what? Stress. Stress is a perverted relationship to time. What would it look like for you to go to sleep tonight not worrying about, not angsting about, not getting anxious about things that are left undone or things that are outside of your control, people that are outside of your control? What would it look like for you, like David in Psalm 3 and 4, to just simply close your eyes and go to sleep and just rest in the Lord? Second is not only our relationship to time, but our relationship to expectations. Pastors, you are human. You have physical limitations. You are not omnipotent. You're not omnipresent. You're not omniscient. You're not omnicompetent. You're not superhuman. But more often than not, that's what's desired of you, right? You're supposed to be a professional counselor, a world-class orator, an academician, a PhD in theology, be ready for a financial advisor, a lawyer, an employment supervisor. I mean, what's demanded of all of you in today's culture and society is just absolutely unreasonable. And that's what the world pushes us towards too, right? Is to develop these, what David Brooks calls these resume virtues. In the New York Times in 2015, David wrote a really helpful article, and he said it's such an irony that in American culture, he says there are typically 2 kinds of virtues that we encourage people to cultivate. The first of which are what he calls resume virtues, things about your resume, your CV, the letters after your name, and then he talks about eulogy virtues, right? Who you are as a person. He says our culture over time has completely downplayed eulogy virtues, and they have raised up these resume virtues as the key to success. And he says that the odd thing is that when you go to a funeral, right, you've all done funerals, you've all been to funerals, none of us talk about resume virtues at funerals, right? Have you ever been at a funeral where a person's CV gets read off? Have you ever been at a funeral where a person's employment history gets read off, or their degrees, or their GPA? No, what gets mentioned at funerals? It's the eulogy virtues. It's about, man, that person was caring, that person was compassionate, that person showed up, or the opposite. Those things are absent, and they're not talked about. Brooks says, man, what would it look like if we encourage people to cultivate eulogy virtues instead of resume virtues? Right? When we think about expectations on ourselves, right, what are the expectations that we are putting on ourselves? Is it just to perform more, to add to our resume, or is it to grow in the wisdom and nurture and admonition of the Lord? Thirdly, navigating our personal relationship with the Lord. Right? I think this is something that we don't think about enough. Again, we talk a lot about it to other people, but what does our relationship to God look like? What's the main narrative that runs through our mind as it relates to the Lord, right? What is the Lord's fundamental posture towards you? I see a lot of pastors in counseling for depression and for burnout, and I'll ask them that. I'll say, what is God's fundamental posture towards you? Is it, man, you really need to do more. You need to try harder. You need to be a better fill in the blank, a better manager, a better pastor. What is the Lord's fundamental posture towards you? Once you discover that, how can you continually live out that reality? Like in Matthew chapter 3, where God and the Holy Spirit and Jesus are all present at Jesus' baptism, right? The Spirit descends on him, and the voice of the Lord says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." His past tense, right? Before any of Jesus' public ministry, before all of the great things that he does, God's fundamental posture towards his son is this is my beloved son, whom I am well pleased. If we really believe our theology, right? If we really believe that what justification is that the active and passive obedience of Christ, his righteousness, gets credited to our account, then what does that mean about God's fundamental posture towards you? Is it a posture of disappointment? Is it a posture of try harder, do better, work harder? No, God's fundamental posture towards you is, no, this is my beloved son. This is my beloved daughter, in whom I am well pleased. So how can we remind ourselves of that? How can we retell that narrative to ourselves? Second S is Sabbath. Abraham Heschel, famous Jewish rabbi, says if you work with your hands, Sabbath with your mind. If you work with your mind, Sabbath with your hands. One of the things for most pastors and ministry leaders, I would say, out of those two, you are tending to work more with what? With your mind. So when I'm trying to counsel and work with pastors about Sabbath, it's not just, hey, like, go to a coffee shop and just, sit and drink coffee. I think a part of Sabbath might actually be using your hands. It might actually be engaging in more tactile activities. This has been a huge part of rest and Sabbath for me, right? What does it look like to do things with my hands, to get outside, to garden, to cook, to take care of plants? Like for some of you, it might be more exercise, it might be more movement, it might be hiking, it might be more physical activities. But if you were constantly working with your mind, right? I should say in verse 10 of what rest looks like is doing something physical, engaging in some type of activity. How can you, as a person, truly rest before the Lord? One of the questions I ask my clients, my counselees who are coming in, is I ask them, what would be arrested? And then you put your name. What would arrested Jonathan look like? And I asked this question in the past 2 weeks to two of my pastor counselees, and both of them said, I don't know. I genuinely don't know what a arrested David would look like. I don't know what arrested Jonathan would look like. I don't know what arrested Susan would look like. I don't even have a category for that. There's too much to be done. What would happen if I just Sabbathed and took rest? The church would probably fall apart if I didn't do anything. So that's a problem, right? I talked to another pastor earlier last week, and he says, listen, he said, I don't know why, but I can't stop saying yes. He says, I don't even want to, but I just keep saying yes to all of these different things. Friends, we have to engage in Sabbath. Walter Brueggemann says, Sabbath is not simply the pause that refreshes, it is the pause that transforms. Sabbath is not just the pause that refreshes. It's not just about, go on a beach and drink a Mai Tai and just, read a good book. That's not necessarily what we're after. Sabbath is a pause that transforms, that changes your heart before the Lord. Number 3, what's one of the ways that we can move towards it? Well, solitude and silence. And what I want to say about this is that solitude and silence is different than isolation. Right? If you think, okay, I'm all about solitude and silence. If you want me to get away from my kids, get away from my church members and my spouse, I'm happy to do that. That's not exactly what we're after with solitude and silence. Solitude and silence is about entering into a relationship with the Lord. Tim Keller wrote a really helpful article during COVID about burnout and about 4 ways to avoid ministry burnout. And one of the things that he noted, he said, one of the ways that we avoid burnout is through extraordinary prayer. It's by going into solitude and silence so that we can commune with God in prayer. And he notes, he says, listen, the more popular Jesus became, the more he did, the more we see in the Gospels that he pulled away and paused for prayer. And what would that look like for you? What would that look like for you to carve out intentional times in your schedule to actually pause and to enter into a season of solitude and silence with the Lord? Right? There is so much noise around us. There are so many things that demand our attention that silence and solitude, honestly, for a lot of us, can be really difficult. Right? That's why we are so busy, is because we're afraid of silence and solitude. We're afraid of what negative emotions might come to the surface if there is no noise or external stimuli around us, right? But maybe that's actually part of the first step in diagnosing our own hearts, is realizing, listen, we actually do need to quiet ourselves before the Lord. We actually do need to engage in rhythms of silence and solitude. Number 4, actually I'll read this quote from John Mark Comer. He says, the foundational question of discipleship is, how do I make myself more available to the work of grace? The goal of stillness isn't just quiet and peace, it is to make ourselves more available to God. It reminds me, Comer's quote reminds me of, he's a Catholic mystic. He has a few good lines, but Ronald Wolheiser says, prayer perhaps is this, it's getting close enough to hear God say, I love you. It's getting close enough to hear God say, I love you. When you're depressed, when you're burnt out, when you're struggling, right? Sometimes it is those simple, not simplistic, it is those simple truths that we need to hear and be reminded of. That the Lord is for us. Psalm 56:9. That the Lord loves us. The Lord doesn't condemn us. That the Lord delights in us. Number 4, our final one is socializing. And this is just, again, a way to talk about the need for friendship. The number one thing I hear from pastors, which breaks my heart, is pastors who say, pastors can't have friends. I tried it. You cannot have friends in your own church. You get betrayed. Trust gets broken. It feels like you're playing favorites. They'll let you down. You can't take off your pastor hat. And I think that I understand the heart of a lot of those arguments, but I would say I share the concerns, but I would arrive at a different conclusion. I think friendship is absolutely necessary for pastors. Again, why would we advocate for something, preach for something, and then not practice it in our own lives? That only increases duality and hypocrisy in our own hearts. Pastors, you need friends. The data on this is pretty consistent. Lifeway did some research on pastors, and you know one of the correlations that they found is that pastors who have friends in ministry tend to rate their overall ministry health better, meaning that they feel more invigorated and more equipped and more excited about ministry when they have friends. The opposite is true. When people and pastors don't have friends, they tend to rate their overall ministry satisfaction much lower. So what would a part of reorienting your life around the Lord and to the Lord look like as it revolves around your social life? What would it look like for you to pursue friends in your congregation, right? What would it look like to take steps towards vulnerability and to honesty and to ask, hey, listen, would you like to get together for coffee as a friend? Not necessarily as a pastor or as an elder or as a ministry leader, but just as a friend. What might that be? We'll close finally with this quote from Thomas Willard. Willard writes this. He says, the first and most basic thing that we can do and must do is to keep God before our minds. This is the fundamental secret of caring for our souls. Our part in thus practicing the presence of God is to direct and redirect our minds constantly to Him. In the early time of our practicing, we may well be challenged by our burdensome habits of dwelling on things less than God. But these are habits, not the law of gravity, and can be broken. A new, graceful habit will replace the former ones as we take intentional steps towards keeping God before us. Soon our minds will return to God as the needle of the compass constantly returns to the north. If God is the great longing of our souls, He will become the pole star of our inward beings. It reminds me of what David says in Psalm 16:9. He says, I have set the Lord always before my face, and at His right hand are pleasures forevermore. What does the life of orientation look like? What does the life that is coming out of burnout and depression look like? I think that captures it. What does it look like to set the Lord always before my face? What does it look like for the Lord to be my North Star, right? And I hope in hearing all of this, you hear the distinctive between a biblical view of self-care and what the world offers, right? In the world's economy of self-care, it's all about who? It's about me, right? It's about taking better care, having a spa day, or treating yourself, or doing something kind to yourself. But the biblical model of self-care is more about what does proper stewardship of what God has given to me, what does that look like so that I can better worship I've also included there for you a few friends of mine who do a lot of work with pastors and ministry leaders, either by way of longer-term intensive or short-term counseling. And I texted all three of them right before and just said, hey, would you be in prayer for these men and women who are going to be coming to this? Because I'm hopefully encouraging them to seek out help, and maybe they might in some ways pursue one of your organizations. But I've included all three of them there for you. They all offer different things, but I am very much about pastors and ministry leaders getting good quality help. That, for many of us, is one step towards that life and reorientation. So if you have questions about that, please let me know. If you're looking for the electronic copy of this handout, it's linked on my Instagram profile. So I know some of you might prefer electronic copies, and there's some hyperlinks in your handout, which obviously you can't click on from your handout. So if you prefer the electronic copy, I've tried to make that available to you there. So I think we have a few minutes left. I'd love to take any questions or comments or feedback. And if there's not any, then I can close this with prayer. Questions? Comments right here? Gary?
Hi. I was curious, do you have any insight on how we would implement this at a team level or like organizational level?
Yeah.
I think all of us are very helpful personally. I was curious, team, organizational culture.
Yes. I think that's great. I think, yeah, not only is this something that I find that we struggle with individually, but it is something that we struggle with corporately. I would say as early on as you can, if you can build into your ministry team just a theology of limitation, a theology of I cannot meet every need, I cannot attend to every text or phone call, just setting healthy and proper boundaries around yourself and around your time, I think is such an important thing. I tell my team at Fieldstone all the time, I mean, again, leading a team of counselors, it's very easy to constantly give, and to ignore our own internal hearts before the Lord. So maybe 1 out of every 4 meetings, or 1 out of every 4 gatherings, you pause and you talk and you check in. Hey, how are we all doing? What's been, just to use 3 easy words, what's been good? What's been hard? What's been bad over the past few weeks? Who would like to share that? I will say this, I think if you're leading a team, one of the best ways that you can get more of that from your people is by modeling it. So practicing vulnerability with your team. Saying, hey, can I share with you? And again, that's what I so appreciate. From the stage, we've already heard from so many people talking very honestly about their struggles. If I was a church member and I was hearing a pastor talk about depression and getting a mental health assessment, you know what that would do for me? That would immediately destigmatize that for myself. And man, if my pastor is showing that, that's surely something that he gets and understands and can take to about. So leading the way with vulnerability and incentivizing vulnerability. Doing different things. Again, if your team mainly is a team that's working with their mind, what would it look like for them to rest and refresh themselves with their hands? If your team does a lot of stuff with their hands, like they're doing children's ministry stuff, or they're doing a lot of tactile, physical things, what would a Sabbath that is maybe built more around silence and solitude and space, what would that look like? So trying to build those things in, I think, is really important. But great question. Other questions? That's a good question. It's right for you to ask me that and put me on the spot. At first I thought, well, it's probably not that bad, like burnout, not like on the verge of a mental breakdown or anything like that. So my instinct was to rationalize it, and I think one of the first steps I particularly to do was to share it with my wife, which is what I did. And I was like, hey, here's what my counselor said about me today. What do you think? And she immediately said, oh yeah, definitely. So thank you for sharing that. And here's one of the things that he encouraged me to do that I'll share with you to see if it's going to be helpful. He said, well, it sounds like maybe you need some time to process or to think about some of the things that you're they're going through or struggling with. And I said, well, it just seems really selfish for me to take away time from my family. I have 4 young kids, a wife, and ministry obligations. Self-care seems really selfish, and I just don't want to be a burden. And tell my wife, hey, I'm gonna like take a day off and like go to a coffee shop or something. And he said, there's a difference in saying, hey, this is something I need, like I absolutely need this, and simply saying, hey, it would be helpful to me if I did this. So instead of demanding it, like, hey, I need to go take a day off, just simply make the request. And, that took some practice and it took some time, but just saying, hey, what do you need to do, and reframing it of what would be helpful for you to do. So, yeah, maybe it is helpful for you to take a half day off. So practically what it means for me is some accountability with my paid time off. So we've done an audit of my time off from like a year before, and I have used up probably 3/4 of my PTO. And my wife told me, she said, if you don't take all of your PTO, I'm going to be really upset with you. And it was a good kind of upset. And so like we just have a running track record of, okay, what and how many days will I take off? And I'd say for all of you who are pastors, don't leave paid time off on the table. If your church has given you PTO, you should take that PTO. That is there. That is a gift and a grace for your outreach and the people that you're leading. So that's maybe one small part. I'm still a work in progress. So I hope that you guys hear from me. I have not arrived. I'm by no means like a burnout guru. I'm very much more similar to you than I am different. So this is still very much something I'm having to preach to myself and tell myself on a regular basis. Other questions?
So one of the words that I hear often when it comes to pastor wrestling, it's that word of process. Process is change. I think in our experience with people who process things, they have not processed the sense of it comes to different conclusions. Kind of like Chinese pastor, and he goes to a conference and I process the question completely the wrong way. Maybe you can help us with what are some proper questions that we can ask ourselves when we're reflecting in the time that we have with the Lord to kind of guide us into a good process?
Absolutely. That is such a good question. I would say use Psalm 31 as a template, right? So David comes to the Lord, he names what is broken, he identifies the good, and he invites others in. So maybe the first one is, okay, what does it look like for me to come to the Lord? What can I acknowledge about who the Lord is? What is true about him? What's an attribute of who the Lord is that can ground me in this moment? Because, the Psalm, Calvin said the Psalms do 2 things. They identify essential human need, and then they always connect it to an essential attribute of God. So, God, I am in trouble. God, you are a refuge. God, I am feeling terrorized by enemies all around me. God, you are my strength and my shield and my defender. Right? What he's saying there is that the Psalms are never just boilerplate. Right? The Psalms are not just ever telling us, hey, here's some generic information about God. The Psalms are telling us about specific people and specific real-world troubles, and then connecting them to who the Lord is. So I'd say that's the first thing. And the second is, the name what is broken is maybe a little bit easier. Of just, what is hard right now? What's broken in my life? Or when I'll ask people, what are you feeling right now? I would put anybody on the spot right now, but a lot of times in counseling, I'll ask my clients, I'll just say, hey, could you describe to me right now what you're feeling? What are you experiencing? And it's like deer in the headlights. I don't know, like hungry, I don't want to be here, this is really hard. I'm like, okay, that's a step. And, I'll take it to Psalm 31 and say, have you ever felt comfortable using this language? Like this idea, like when David talks in Psalm 31, he says that there's terror on every side. It's a phrase that Jeremiah picks up later on. A lot of people actually thought Jeremiah wrote Psalm 31. But that phrase, terror on every side, it has this idea of being hemmed in and constricted. It means feeling like I can't move. I feel suffocated. Isn't that such a graphic picture, right, of maybe something you felt? Ever felt like, man, I feel trapped? There's no good option with this particular church situation. I just feel like, man, if I go this way, people are going to be unhappy with me. If I make this decision, people are going to be unhappy with me. Scripture says, I know that. I know what that experience feels like. I know what it looks like to be hemmed in on every side. So that's a starting point. I would say my second process then would be, it's always best done if you can with a friend. And that's to invite others in. I mean, for you to ask yourself these questions is good, but man, what would it look like if you just had a friend? Say, like, hey, could we ask each other a few questions? Right? Maybe you write some of them down in advance and pass them along. That to me would be so helpful and so beneficial when you're feeling multiple words with one stone. But I would say the Psalms, I think, give you a really good template of what that process is like, for sure. People who are not aware of their internal life, I think oftentimes it plays out in their external life in really difficult and harmful ways. Okay. Any other questions? I'll stay after for a few minutes. I'd be happy to interact, but thank you guys so much for coming and just for offering your attention. That's been